The stagecoach lurched to a stop, dust swirling like ghosts around its wheels, as Evelyn Cartwright pressed her trembling hand against the worn leather seat. Through the small window, she could see the skeletal outline of Burnt Hollow emerging from the desert heat, like a mirage built of desperation and broken dreams. The wind chimes hanging from every porch sang their hollow song, not made of metal, but of bleached animal bones that clattered together in the relentless wind, a local custom meant to ward off the spirits of the desert. Oz. "End of the line, miss." The driver called down, his voice rough as sandpaper. Burnt Hollow. Evelyn's fingers found the small locket at her throat containing the last photograph of her mother, gaunt, hollow-eyed, clutching Evelyn's hand as consumption slowly claimed her life in their cramped Chicago tenement. "Don't let them break you, my darling," had been her mother's final words, whispered through blood-flecked lips. "Promise me you'll find a way to live, not just survive." Now stepping down onto the sun-baked earth of this God-forsaken town, Evelyn wondered if survival was all she had left to hope for. Her mail-order marriage to Thomas Brennan, a rancher she'd never met, represented her last chance to escape the grinding poverty that had killed her mother. The $50 in her worn purse, every cent she possessed, had paid for this journey into the unknown. The town square stretched before her like an execution ground, surrounded by weathered buildings that seemed to lean away from each other in mutual distrust. A few dozen people had gathered, their faces shadowed by hat brims and suspicion. At their center stood a tall man with a silver star pinned to his black vest, his pale eyes studying her with the intensity of a predator, sizing up prey. "Miss Cartwright, I presume." Sheriff Harrow's voice carried the mock courtesy of a snake offering to share its den. "I'm afraid there's been some complications regarding your intended." From the crowd, Evelyn caught sight of a broad-shouldered man with coal-black hair and calloused hands that spoke of honest work. Jonah Whitmore, the town blacksmith, stood frozen at the edge of the gathering. His dark eyes locked on her face with an expression of recognition and growing horror. Something in his stance, the way his muscles tensed as if preparing to bolt forward, then suddenly relaxed in defeat, told her he had witnessed scenes like this before. Jonah's mind raced back to 3 months ago, when he had watched Sarah being dragged from their home by Harrow's men on fabricated charges of witchcraft. He had started to run to her aid, just as every instinct now screamed at him to help this frightened woman. But the memory of the rifle butt that had cracked his ribs when he tried to intervene for Sarah held him paralyzed. His wife's terrified face, as they hauled her away, flashed before his eyes the last time he had seen her alive, according to Harrow's official report. "On what complications?" Evelyn's voice came out steadier than she felt, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. Harrow's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "Thomas Brennan met with an unfortunate accident yesterday. Thrown from his horse neck, snapped clean. Such a tragedy." He paused, letting the words sink in like poison. "But then, we've had quite a few accidents since word spread that a woman of questionable virtue was coming to our God-fearing town." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone near the back shouted, "Witch!" and the word was taken up by others, growing louder with each repetition. Evelyn saw children being pulled closer to their mothers, saw hands moving instinctively to cross themselves or clutch at protective talismans. "That's preposterous," Evelyn said, her voice cutting through the rising hysteria. "I'm a seamstress from Chicago. I've never practiced anything but honest work in my life." "Honest work?" Harrow laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Tell me, Miss Cartwright, why would a virtuous woman need to travel halfway across the country to find a husband? What decent man in Chicago would have you?" The crowd pressed closer, forming a tightening circle around her. Evelyn caught glimpses of faces twisted by fear and mob mentality. The baker who clutched a rolling pin like a weapon, and the store owner whose wife had supposedly been cursed with fever just last week. The young mother who pulled her daughter protectively behind her skirts. Jonah took a half-step forward, his blacksmith's instincts crying out against the injustice unfolding before him. But then he felt the phantom pain in his ribs, remembered the helplessness in Sarah's eyes, and his courage failed him. He watched in sick fascination as history prepared to repeat itself, knowing he was too much a coward to prevent it. My mother died of consumption. Evelyn said, her chin raised in defiance, despite the terror coursing through her veins. I had no family left, no prospects in a city that chews up the poor and spits out their bones. I sought honest marriage to an honest man. If that makes me a witch in your eyes, then your eyes see evil where none exists. Lying Jezebel. The voice belonged to Pastor Matheson, a gaunt man whose black robes seemed to absorb the desert sun. The very day of your arrival brings death to poor Thomas. Coincidence? I think not. God's justice is swift, but the devil's influence is swifter still. Before Evelyn could respond, a rock sailed through the air, striking her shoulder with enough force to stagger her. Then another and another. The crowd was transforming before her eyes, from frightened townspeople into a mindless mob hungry for blood and righteousness in equal measure. Enough! Harrow's voice boomed across the square, and the stone-throwing ceased. We are civilized people, not savages. If this woman is indeed what we suspect, then she deserves a proper trial by the laws of God and man. The sheriff's words might have sounded reasonable to an outsider, but Evelyn could see the calculation behind his pale eyes. This wasn't about justice. It was about control, about feeding the town's fear, while maintaining the appearance of authority. She was a stranger, friendless and defenseless, the perfect scapegoat for whatever darkness had been growing in Burnt Hollow long before her arrival. I demand to speak with a lawyer, she said, though her voice shook now. I have rights as an American citizen. Rights. Harrow's laugh was genuinely amused this time. Miss Cartwright, you're 200 miles from the nearest courthouse and 500 miles from anyone who gives a damn about your rights. In Burnt Hollow, I am the law, and I say you'll remain our guest until we can determine your true nature. 2 deputies materialized from the crowd, brutal-looking men with the scarred knuckles of professional violence. They seized Evelyn's arms with unnecessary force, ignoring her protests, as they began dragging her toward the small stone building that served as the town jail. As they hauled her away, Fush caught one last glimpse of the blacksmith. Jonah Whitmore stood motionless in the crowd, his face a mask of anguish and self-loathing. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and she saw something there that gave her the faintest spark of hope. The recognition of a kindred soul, someone who understood what it meant to be powerless in the face of injustice. But then the moment passed, and she was thrust into the suffocating darkness of her cell, where the sound of bone wind chimes seemed to follow her even through the thick stone walls. The jail cell was barely 6 feet square, with walls that sweated moisture during the day and radiated cold during the desert nights. A thin straw mattress lay on the floor, already home to insects that skittered away from the light. In one corner sat a bucket that served purposes Evelyn preferred not to contemplate. The single window was no more than a slit in the stone too narrow for escape, but wide enough to let in the sound of the town's growing hysteria. For 3 days, she had been Harrow's prisoner, and in that time, the sheriff had proven himself a master of psychological warfare. He visited her cell twice daily, always with a different story about the supposed evidence against her. Yesterday, it had been the discovery of strange herbs, in Thomas Brennan's saddlebags herbs, that any rational person would recognize as common medicinal plants, but which Harrow claimed were instruments of dark magic. The devil's claw. He had said, holding up a dried root that Evelyn recognized as echinacea. Found it right where poor Thomas breathed his last. Tell me, Miss Cartwright, how does a simple seamstress know to plant such poison where it would do the most harm? She had tried to explain that echinacea was used to treat fevers and infections, that any woman who had nursed a sick relative would recognize it. But Harrow wasn't interested in rational explanations. He was building a case like a spider builds a web not to catch truth, but to trap his prey. The real torture, however, came from listening to the town's transformation outside her window. What had begun as fearful whispers had grown into public meetings where citizens competed to share stories of supernatural encounters and unexplained misfortunes. Mrs. Henderson's chickens had stopped laying eggs, clearly the work of a witch. Young Billy Morrison had fallen from a tree and broken his arm, obviously cursed. The well water had developed a strange taste, devil's work, without question. Each accusation built upon the last, creating a framework of evidence that would have been laughable in any civilized court, but carried deadly weight in a town already primed for superstition. Evelyn began to understand that her actual guilt or innocence was irrelevant. She had become a symbol, a focal point for every fear and frustration that had been festering in Burnt Hollow, like infection in an untreated wound. On the fourth morning, her cell door opened to admit an unexpected visitor. Miriam Collins was a small, weathered woman whose dark skin marked her as one of the few people in town with even less social standing than Evelyn herself. She carried a tin plate of beans and cornbread, along with a cup of water that was blessedly cool. "Thought you might be hungry," Miriam said quietly, setting the food on the floor near Evelyn's mattress. "Haven't seen you eat much of what they've been bringing." It was true. The previous meals had been barely edible slop, clearly intended more to humiliate than nourish. This food, however, was prepared with care, the beans seasoned with herbs, the cornbread still warm from the oven. "Why are you helping me?" Evelyn asked, accepting the plate gratefully. Miriam was quiet for a long moment, her eyes studying the stone floor. "I know what it's like to be blamed for things beyond your control," she finally said. "Been the scapegoat for this town's problems more times than I can count. Only difference is my skin color makes folks expect the worst from me. You're supposed to be one of them, which makes your situation all the more dangerous. You don't believe I'm a witch?" A bitter smile crossed Miriam's face. "Honey, if wishes could kill half this town, would have been dead years ago from the curses I've thrown at them in my heart. If you had real power, you wouldn't be sitting in this cell." They talked quietly while Evelyn ate, and she learned that Miriam had been in Burnt Hollow for nearly 2 decades, working as a laundress and occasional cook for the wealthier families. She had seen the town's gradual decay, the way fear and suspicion had replaced the frontier's spirit of cooperation that had once allowed such communities to thrive. "Used to be folks here looked out for each other," Miriam explained. "Desert's hard enough without turning on your neighbors." But then Harrow came to town about 5 years ago, and things started to change. People began disappearing, mostly women who'd spoken out against him or refused his advances. Always some explanation, of course. Accidents, Indian raids, running off with traveling merchants. But the pattern was clear to anyone with eyes to see. Why hasn't anyone stopped him? Who's going to stop a man with a badge and a gun, especially when he's careful to target people without family or connections? Single women, widows, folks like me who don't have anyone to speak for them. Miriam's voice carried decades of accumulated anger and frustration. And now he's found the perfect solution. Instead of making people disappear quietly, he lets the town do his dirty work for him. Convince everyone there's a witch among them, and they'll gladly burn anyone he points at. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of heavy footsteps on the stone floor outside. Miriam quickly gathered up the empty plate and cup, but not quickly enough. The cell door swung open to reveal Deputy Crawford, a thick-necked man whose primary qualifications for law enforcement seemed to be his enthusiasm for violence. "Well, well." Crawford drawled, his small eyes moving between the two women. "Looks like the witch has found herself an accomplice. Sheriff's gonna be real interested to hear about this. I brought her food, Miriam said steadily. No law against Christian charity. Christian charity. Crawford's laugh was ugly. That's a good one. Sheriff Harrow's been wondering how our prisoner here has been staying so healthy despite her trials. Now we know. Been getting help from another servant of darkness. Before either woman could protest, Crawford seized Miriam's arm and began dragging her from the cell. Come on, darky. Time you learned what happens to folks who consort with devils. Evelyn lunged forward, grabbing the deputy's other arm. Leave her alone. She hasn't done anything wrong. Crawford backhanded her with casual violence, sending her sprawling against the stone wall. Stay back, witch, unless you want to watch what we do to your friend here. As Crawford hauled Miriam away, the older woman looked back at Evelyn with eyes full of resignation rather than surprise. This was the natural order of things in Burnt Hollow, the weak preyed upon by the strong, and the strong protected by the weight of law and custom. Evelyn pressed her face to the narrow window, straining to see what was happening in the town square. What she witnessed there would haunt her for the rest of her life. They had erected a whipping post in the center of the square, and Crawford was binding Miriam's wrists to the rough wood, while a crowd gathered to watch. Sheriff Harrow stood nearby, addressing the growing mob with the practiced rhythm of a man who had orchestrated such spectacles before. Citizens of Burnt Hollow. His voice carried clearly to Evelyn's cell. We have discovered that the witch has been receiving aid from another of Satan's servants. This woman, he gestured toward Miriam, has been feeding the prisoner, no doubt strengthening her for some dark ritual planned against our community. The crowd murmured and shifted their faces, showing the same mixture of fear and anticipation that Evelyn had seen on her first day. These were ordinary people, farmers and shopkeepers, mothers and fathers, but mob psychology had transformed them into something monstrous. The penalty for consorting with witches is well established in biblical law. Harrow continued. 20 lashes delivered publicly so that all may see the consequences of trafficking with evil. The first crack of the whip echoed across the square like thunder, followed by Miriam's strangled cry. Evelyn tried to turn away, but something compelled her to watch, to bear witness to the brutality being committed in her name. Each lash tore through Miriam's thin dress, leaving bloody stripes across her back, while the crowd counted aloud with sick enthusiasm. By the 10th lash, Miriam had stopped crying out, her body hanging limply from the post. By the 15th, even some members of the crowd were shifting uncomfortably, their bloodlust beginning to curdle into shame. But Harrow was relentless, counting out each stroke with mechanical precision until all 20 had been delivered. When it was over, they cut Miriam down and left her crumpled in the dust while the crowd slowly dispersed. A few women, those with consciences not yet completely cauterized by fear, helped carry her to the home of Doc Patterson, the town's physician. But the message had been delivered with crystalline clarity. Anyone who showed kindness to Evelyn Cartwright would suffer the same fate or worse. That night, as Evelyn lay on her straw mattress, listening to the bone wind chimes rattling in the desert wind, she finally understood the true nature of her situation. This wasn't about justice or even superstition. It was about power, Harrow's power, to control an entire community through carefully orchestrated terror. She was just the latest tool in his arsenal, a convenient focus for the town's fear that allowed him to eliminate anyone who might threaten his authority. But understanding her predicament and escaping it were two very different things. As the days passed and Harrow's visits became more frequent and threatening, Evelyn began to realize that her time was running out. The sheriff was building toward some grand finale that would cement his control over Burnt Hollow once and for all. She just prayed that when the moment came, she would have the courage to face it with the dignity her mother had taught her, even if she couldn't escape it. The scream that shattered the pre-dawn quiet of Burnt Hollow was unlike anything Evelyn had ever heard, a sound of pure, animal terror that seemed to rise from the very earth itself. She jolted upright on her straw mattress, pressing her face to the narrow window to peer out into the dark town square. Orange light flickered against the buildings, and the acrid smell of smoke began to seep through the stone walls of her cell. Fire. In a desert town built primarily of dried wood and adobe, fire was everyone's worst nightmare. But as Evelyn watched the chaos unfold outside, she began to understand that this was no accident. The Henderson house was blazing like a torch, flames leaping from its windows and reaching toward the star-filled sky. People poured from their homes in night clothes, forming bucket brigades and shouting instructions to each other in the organized panic of a community that had drilled for this exact scenario. But even as they fought the fire, Evelyn could hear another sound threading through the chaos, whispered accusations and fearful speculation about the cause. "It's the witch," someone shouted above the roar of flames. "She's called down hellfire on our town." The cry was taken up by others, growing in volume and conviction until it became a chant that competed with the crackling of burning timber. Even as they fought to save their neighbor's home, the townspeople were already deciding who to blame for its destruction. Sheriff Harrow appeared in the square, as if summoned by the crisis, his pale eyes reflecting the orange flames as he moved through the crowd. He didn't participate in the firefighting efforts. Instead, he spoke quietly to small groups of townspeople, his words too low for Evelyn to hear, but their effect clearly visible. Faces turned toward the jail with expressions of hatred and fear. Hands clenched into fists. The bucket brigades began to slow as attention shifted from saving the Henderson house to discussing what should be done about its supposed cause. By the time the fire was finally contained and the damage was catastrophic, the Henderson house was nothing but a smoking ruin, and worse, old Mrs. Henderson had been found inside, overcome by smoke before she could escape. The town's grief and shock provided perfect fertile ground for Harrow's poisonous suggestions about supernatural causation. As dawn broke over Burnt Hollow, painting the smoke-filled sky in shades of red and gold that seemed ominous rather than beautiful, Evelyn heard the approaching sound of angry voices. The mob was coming for her, and this time she suspected Harrow wouldn't bother with the pretense of civilized justice. The jail door burst open with a crash that made Evelyn flinch backward against the stone wall. Harrow entered first, followed by Deputies Crawford and Morrison, and behind them came a crowd of townspeople, whose faces were twisted by grief and rage into something barely recognizable as human. Evelyn Cartwright. Harrow's voice carried the formal cadence of a judge pronouncing sentence. "You stand accused of the practice of witchcraft, specifically the summoning of supernatural flames that resulted in the destruction of property and the death of an innocent woman. How do you answer these charges?" "Answer, I've been locked in this cell all night." Evelyn protested, her voice cracking with strain. "How could I possibly have started a fire from here? Witches don't need to be present to work their evil," Pastor Matheson declared from the crowd. His gaunt face was streaked with soot, and his black robes bore scorch marks from his efforts to fight the fire. "The devil's servants can strike from any distance, using cursed objects or demonic familiars to do their bidding." The crowd murmured agreement, and their heads nodding in unison like wheat bending before a storm. Evelyn could see Tom Henderson among them, his face hollow with loss and desperate for someone to blame for his mother's death. Beside him stood his wife, clutching their young daughter protectively, while tears streamed down her soot-stained cheeks. "This is madness," Evelyn said, though she could hear the futility in her own voice. "I'm a seamstress from Chicago. I don't know anything about starting fires or summoning demons. I barely know how to light a stove without burning my breakfast." "Lying won't save you now, witch." Crawford growled, his hand resting meaningfully on the grip of his pistol. "We found evidence at the fire scene. Strange symbols carved into Mrs. Henderson's doorframe, burnt herbs that no decent Christian would recognize. Doc Patterson says he's never seen burns like the ones on the old woman's body. Unnatural, he called them." Evelyn's mind raced as she tried to process this information. Symbols, herbs. It was obvious that someone had planted evidence to support the witchcraft narrative. But who, and more importantly, why go to such elaborate lengths when the town was already primed to believe the worst about her? The answer came to her with sickening clarity as she watched Harrow's performance. He wasn't just destroying her, he was creating a template for future accusations. By establishing evidence of supernatural activity, he was building a system that could be used to eliminate anyone who threatened his authority. All he needed to do was plant a few carved symbols, scatter some unusual herbs, and the town would gladly destroy itself, hunting for witches that existed only in Harrow's imagination. And the time for talk is over. Harrow announced, his voice cutting through Evelyn's racing thoughts. The good people of Burnt Hollow demand justice for Mrs. Henderson's murder, and they shall have it. Evelyn Cartwright, you will be tested according to the ancient laws that govern such cases. If you are innocent, God will protect you. If you are guilty... He shrugged eloquently, allowing the crowd to fill in the implications. What kind of test? Evelyn asked, though she dreaded the answer. Harrow's smile was cold as winter moonlight. Trial by ordeal, of course. We'll start with water. If you sink, you're innocent. If you float, you're a witch. Then fire. If the flames consume you cleanly, you were wrongly accused. If they refuse to touch you, you're in league with Satan. The twisted logic of it was breathtaking in its cruelty. Either way, Evelyn would die quickly. If she was innocent, slowly. If she was guilty. It was the perfect system for someone like Harrow, guaranteeing the removal of his target while giving the community the illusion of divine justice. This is murder, she said flatly. Nothing more and nothing less. You're planning to kill me because I'm convenient, not because I'm guilty of anything. Blasphemy. Pastor Matheson's voice rose to a near shriek. She speaks against God's holy justice. Surely this proves her allegiance to the Prince of Darkness. The crowd pressed closer, their faces flushed with religious fervor and mob hysteria. Evelyn could smell their sweat and smoke-stained clothes, could see the spittle flying from their lips as they shouted condemnations. These were people who had lived beside her in relative peace just days ago, but fear had transformed them into something unrecognizable. As the deputies moved forward to seize her, Evelyn caught sight of a familiar face in the crowd. Jonah Whitmore stood near the back, his dark eyes fixed on her with an expression of torment that cut through her fear like a blade. For a moment she thought he might speak up, might find the courage to challenge the madness consuming his town. But then someone jostled him from behind, and the moment was lost as he melted back into the crowd. Crawford and Morrison grabbed her arms with unnecessary force, their fingers digging into her flesh hard enough to leave bruises. As they dragged her from the cell, Evelyn held her head high and tried to summon her mother's strength. If she was going to die, she would do it with dignity intact, even if the people of Burnt Hollow had abandoned theirs entirely. The last thing she saw as they hauled her into the smoke-tainted morning air was Pastor Matheson raising his arms toward heaven, his voice booming across the square, as he called down God's judgment on the witch who walked among them. But his eyes, when they met hers for an instant, held something that looked almost like guilt, as if some small part of him still recognized the monstrous injustice being committed in the name of righteousness. It was a thin thread of hope. But in her current circumstances, Evelyn would take whatever she could get. The testing ground they had prepared for her was a grotesque parody of justice, located in a natural depression just outside the town limits, where the desert had carved a bowl-shaped amphitheater from the red rock. Someone had spent considerable effort transforming this space into an arena for torture, complete with wooden stakes driven deep into the hard-packed earth and iron braziers filled with glowing coals that sent heat shimmers dancing through the air. Nearly the entire population of Burnt Hollow had gathered to witness the spectacle, arranged in a rough circle around the depression, like spectators at some ancient Roman execution. Children perched on their fathers' shoulders for a better view. while mothers held babies who would grow up with memories of this day seared into their consciousness. The bone wind chimes had been brought from town and hung from poles around the perimeter, their hollow rattling providing a macabre soundtrack to the proceedings. Sheriff Harrow stood at the center of it all, like a master of ceremonies, his silver badge catching the desert sun as he addressed the crowd with the practiced confidence of a man who had orchestrated similar events before. Beside him, Pastor Matheson clutched a leather-bound Bible that looked worn from frequent use in situations that had nothing to do with salvation. Citizens of Burnt Hollow. Harrow's voice carried easily across the natural acoustics of the bowl. We gather today, not in anger, but in the pursuit of divine truth. The woman before you stands accused of the most heinous crime known to Christian civilization, the practice of witchcraft and communion with the devil himself. Evelyn had been bound to one of the wooden stakes, her arms stretched above her head and secured with ropes that bit into her wrists. The position was deliberately humiliating, designed to strip away her dignity along with her hope. But she forced herself to stand straight to meet the eyes of her accusers with as much defiance as she could muster. The evidence against her is overwhelming. Harrow continued producing a cloth bundle that he unwrapped with theatrical flourish. Cursed herbs found at the scene of poor Mrs. Henderson's death, symbols of dark magic carved into the doorframe, and testimony from multiple witnesses about unnatural occurrences that began the very day this woman arrived in our God-fearing community. He held up each piece of evidence, in turn dried plants that could have been gathered from any hillside, crude scratches in wood that could have been made with any knife, and accusations from townspeople so primed for supernatural explanations that they would see witchcraft in a cat crossing the street from right to left instead of left to right. From her position at the stake, Evelyn could see the faces in the crowd with horrible clarity. Tom Henderson, still hollow-eyed from grief, nodded along with every word of Harrow's presentation. Mrs. Garrett, the store owner's wife, clutched a wooden cross and muttered prayers under her breath. Even some of the children seemed caught up in the religious fervor, their young faces reflecting the hatred and fear of their parents. But not all the faces showed unanimous conviction. Doc Patterson stood near the edge of the crowd, his expression troubled as he listened to Harrow's description of the unnatural burns supposedly found on Mrs. Henderson's body. Evelyn had caught a glimpse of the physician's initial examination report when Crawford had carelessly left it on the sheriff's desk. It described completely normal smoke inhalation and burns consistent with a house fire, with no mention of anything supernatural. More importantly, she spotted Jonah Whitmore again, this time positioned where he had a clear view of the proceedings. The blacksmith's face was pale beneath his tan, and his hands were clenched into fists that trembled with suppressed emotion. As their eyes met across the distance, she saw him mouth a single word: Sarah. The mention of his missing wife's name sent a chill through Evelyn that had nothing to do with the desert wind. Was he trying to tell her that Sarah had faced a similar ordeal? Or was there something else, some connection she was missing in the growing madness of the moment? Let the testing begin. Pastor Matheson's voice rose above the murmur of the crowd, his Bible held high like a weapon. If this woman is innocent, the Lord God Almighty will surely protect her. If she is guilty, then let his justice be swift and terrible to behold. The first test was to be trial by water, a grotesque inversion of baptism where innocence meant drowning and guilt meant survival. They had dug a deep pit and filled it with water from the town, while creating a makeshift pool that reflected the cloudless sky like a mirror of judgment. Crawford and Morrison began untying Evelyn from the stake, their rough hands leaving new bruises on her already battered arms. "Any last words, witch?" Harrow asked with mock courtesy. "Perhaps a confession that might spare you the worst of what's to come." Evelyn looked out at the sea of faces surrounding her people, who had transformed from ordinary frontier citizens into a mob hungry for blood and righteousness. She thought of her mother's final words about not letting them break her, about finding a way to live. rather than merely survive. Even if she was about to die, she could at least do it on her own terms. "I am not a witch," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the desert air. "I am Evelyn Cartwright, daughter of Mary Cartwright, who died of consumption in a Chicago tenement because she couldn't afford medicine. I came to Burnt Hollow seeking nothing more than an honest life with an honest man. If that makes me guilty in your eyes, then your eyes are blinded by fear and manipulation." She turned her gaze directly to Harrow, meeting his pale eyes with all the defiance she could summon. "And you, Sheriff, know perfectly well that I'm innocent of everything except being convenient. When you murder me today, it won't be justice. It will be the act of a coward who needs scapegoats to maintain his power." The crowd erupted in angry shouts, but Harrow raised his hand for silence. His expression remained calm, but Evelyn could see a flicker of something dangerous in his eyes, the look of a predator that had been unexpectedly challenged by its prey. "Brave words from a condemned woman," he said softly. "Let's see if your devil protects you as well as your tongue does." They dragged her to the edge of the water pit, where a wooden platform had been constructed to hold her while they secured the ropes. The system was ingeniously cruel. If she sank and drowned, her innocence would be proven posthumously. If she somehow managed to float, it would be taken as proof of supernatural aid, and she would be hauled out to face the even more terrible trial by fire. As Crawford and Morrison began binding her arms and legs, preparing to lower her into the water, Evelyn caught sight of movement at the edge of the crowd. Someone was pushing through the gathered townspeople, moving with urgent purpose toward the testing ground. For a moment, hope flared in her chest. Perhaps Doc Patterson had found his courage, or maybe Jonah had finally decided to act. But the figure that emerged from the crowd was neither of those men. Instead, it was Miriam Collins, moving slowly and painfully, but with unmistakable determination. The aftermath of her public whipping was still clearly visible. She walked with a careful hunched gait that spoke of barely healed wounds, and her dark skin bore the pallor of someone who had lost considerable blood. "Stop!" Miriam's voice was weak, but carried surprising authority. "This woman is innocent, and I can prove it." A murmur ran through the crowd as people recognized the woman who had been punished for helping the accused witch. Harrow's expression darkened with annoyance, and something that might have been fear. "For Miriam Collins," the sheriff said with false joviality, "you should be home recovering from your correction. This is no place for someone in your condition. My condition was caused by telling the truth." Miriam replied, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "And I'll tell it again, even if it kills me. Evelyn Cartwright was in her cell all night when the Henderson house caught fire. I know because I was watching." The crowd stirred restlessly, uncertain how to process this development. Harrow's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but he couldn't simply shoot a woman in front of the entire town without some justification. "You were supposed to be recovering from your injuries," he said carefully. "How could you have been watching anything?" Miriam smiled, and despite her pain, there was something triumphant in her expression. "Because I couldn't sleep knowing what you planned to do to an innocent woman. So I kept vigil across from the jail, praying and watching. I saw you and your deputies leave the jailhouse around midnight. I saw you head toward the Henderson place. And I saw the glow in the sky when the fire started while Evelyn Cartwright was still locked in her cell." The silence that followed her words was deafening. Even the bone wind chimes seemed to stop their rattling as the implications sank in. If Miriam was telling the truth, then someone else had started the fire that killed Mrs. Henderson. Someone with access to the materials needed to plant false evidence. Someone who stood to benefit from the town's witch-hunting hysteria. Harrow's face had gone pale, but he recovered quickly. "The ravings of a woman, addled by pain and guilt," he declared. "She's clearly willing to say anything to protect her fellow servant of darkness. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it was beginning to grow. Doc Patterson stepped forward from the crowd, his medical bag clutched in his weathered hands. "Sheriff," he said quietly, "I think we need to discuss the nature of Mrs. Henderson's injuries. There are some inconsistencies in the official report that bear examination." Before Harrow could respond, another voice spoke up from an unexpected quarter. Pastor Matheson, his gaunt face flushed with emotion, lowered his Bible and addressed the crowd directly. "I have sinned," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the testing ground. "God forgive me. I have allowed my fear to overcome my faith, and I have participated in something that shames the very name of Christianity." The crowd erupted in confused murmurs as their spiritual leader continued his unexpected confession. "Sheriff Harrow came to me 3 days ago with evidence of witchcraft, and I accepted it without question because it confirmed my own fears about the stranger among us. But I have spent the last 2 nights in prayer examining that evidence, and I now believe it was manufactured." Harrow's control over the situation was rapidly unraveling. The careful orchestration of religious fervor and mob psychology that had brought them to this point was beginning to collapse as key figures withdrew their support. But instead of retreating, the sheriff doubled down with the desperate aggression of a cornered animal. "Enough," he roared, drawing his pistol and pointing it directly at Miriam Collins. "I see the devil has more servants in this town than I realized. But their lies won't save them any more than they'll save the witch." The naked display of violence shocked the crowd into temporary silence, but it also revealed Harrow's true nature in a way that words never could. Here was their sheriff, their supposed protector, pointing a gun at an injured woman whose only crime was speaking the truth. The spell of authority and righteousness that had held the mob together began to crack like glass under pressure. It was in that moment of fracturing certainty that the real surprise came. From somewhere in the crowd, a voice called out with unmistakable authority, "Put down your weapon, Sheriff. You're under arrest for murder, arson, and conspiracy against the citizens of Burnt Hollow." Every head turned toward the source of the voice, and Evelyn felt her heart stop as she saw who had spoken. Standing at the edge of the testing ground, wearing a U.S. Marshal's badge and backed by 3 armed deputies, was a tall woman with graying hair and scars that spoke of hard-won experience. It was Sarah Whitmore, returned from the dead to claim justice for her town. The recognition hit Evelyn like a physical blow, even as she remained bound and helpless beside the water pit. The woman standing with Marshall's authority at the edge of the crowd bore little resemblance to the gentle wife and mother Jonah had described in his few carefully guarded references to his lost family. This Sarah Whitmore was lean and weathered with gray, streaking her dark hair, and a network of scars across the left side of her face that spoke of violence survived rather than avoided. She wore men's clothing, practical riding pants, and a leather vest, and carried herself with the hard confidence of someone who had learned to trust only her own strength. But it was her eyes that truly showed the cost of whatever ordeal had transformed her from small-town wife to federal law officer. They held a coldness that seemed to freeze the desert air, the gaze of someone who had looked into darkness so profound that ordinary shadows held no terror. "I said, put down your weapon." Sarah repeated her voice, carrying the absolute authority of federal law. Behind her, the 3 deputies she had brought spread out in a practiced pattern, their own guns drawn and ready. Sheriff Marcus Harrow, also known as Marcus Hendricks, also known as Marcus Holbrook. You are under arrest for multiple counts of murder, conspiracy arson, and impersonating a federal officer. The crowd began to murmur and shift as the implications of her words sank in. Harrow wasn't just a corrupt sheriff. He was apparently an imposter with a history of violence that extended far beyond Burnt Hollow. But instead of surrendering, he tightened his grip on his pistol and backed toward the wooden platform where Evelyn remained bound. "Marshall Whitmore," he said, his voice taking on a mocking tone as he recognized her. I should have known you'd crawl out of whatever hole you've been hiding in. Took you long enough to work up the courage for another confrontation. Sarah's expression didn't change, but Evelyn could see her jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. 3 years of tracking you across 5 territories. 3 years of documenting your crimes and gathering evidence. 3 years of waiting for the right moment to bring you to justice. 3 years of running scared, you mean? Harrow's laugh was ugly and triumphant. 3 years of hiding from the truth about what really happened to your precious family. Tell me, Sarah, have you told these good people about your daughter yet? About how she screamed when my men— That's enough. Sarah's voice cut across his taunts like a blade. Whatever you think you can accomplish by threatening these people, it's over. I have federal warrants for your arrest and enough evidence to hang you 3 times over. But Harrow was beyond reason now, his carefully constructed persona crumbling to reveal the desperate criminal beneath. He grabbed Evelyn around the throat with his free arm, using her as a human shield while keeping his gun trained on the crowd. Note, federal warrants don't mean much out here, he snarled. These people belong to me. I've spent 5 years building this perfect little kingdom where I can do whatever I want, and I'm not giving it up because some scarred-up has-been marshal thinks she's found her courage. From her position in Harrow's grip, Evelyn could see the crowd's reaction to this revelation. The spell of authority and religious righteousness that had held them together was completely shattered now, replaced by a growing awareness of how thoroughly they had been manipulated. Faces that had been twisted with witch-hunting fervor now showed confusion, shame, and growing anger at their own gullibility. Tom Henderson, who had been one of the most vocal supporters of Evelyn's execution just minutes earlier, now stood with his mouth agape as he processed the truth about his mother's death. Pastor Matheson had sunk to his knees beside his dropped Bible, his face buried in his hands as the full weight of his participation in Harrow's schemes hit him. Even Doc Patterson looked sick as he undoubtedly reconsidered every suspicious death and unexplained accident that had occurred during Harrow's tenure as sheriff. Let her go, Marcus," Sarah said, using Harrow's real name with deliberate emphasis. "Your quarrel is with me, not with these people. Take me hostage if you need one, but release the innocent woman." Harrow's grip tightened around Evelyn's throat, making her gasp for air. Innocent. This little seamstress has caused me more trouble than she's worth. Do you know how long it took me to arrange poor Thomas Brennan's accident? How carefully I had to plan the Henderson fire to provide the right kind of evidence? She was supposed to be a simple scapegoat, someone I could burn to keep the town focused on outside threats, instead of looking too closely at their beloved sheriff. The casual admission of murder sent a shock through the crowd. Mrs. Henderson hadn't died accidentally in a fire started by supernatural forces. She had been murdered by the man they had trusted to protect them, killed simply to provide evidence against an innocent woman. Jonah Whitmore finally pushed through the crowd, his face a mask of barely controlled rage as he saw his wife alive but scarred, and the woman he had failed to protect being used as a human shield. "Sarah," he called out, his voice breaking with emotion. "I thought they told me you were dead. They said Harrow found your body. I was meant to be dead." Sarah replied without taking her eyes off Harrow. "Marcus made sure of that when he burned our house with me and Emma inside. I barely escaped, and our daughter—" Her voice faltered for just a moment before regaining its steel. "Emma didn't make it out." The revelation hit Jonah like a physical blow. His wife was alive, but their child was truly gone, murdered by the man he had allowed to rule their town, and through fear and manipulation. The guilt and rage that crashed across his features was terrible to witness. "I should have known," he whispered. "I should have fought harder. You should have stayed quiet and let me handle this." Harrow interrupted, pressing his gun against Evelyn's temple. just like you've done for the past 3 years. You always were good at keeping your head down when things got unpleasant. The taunt was designed to break Jonah's spirit, to reduce him to the helpless bystander he had been during Sarah's supposed death. But instead of cowering, the blacksmith's expression hardened into something that would have made his ancestors proud. He had spent 3 years living with the guilt of failing to protect his family. He wouldn't make the same mistake twice. Miriam. He called out, his voice carrying clearly across the testing ground. Do you still have those things I gave you to hide? The injured laundress, who had been standing forgotten at the edge of the confrontation, suddenly straightened with understanding. From beneath her shawl, she produced a cloth bundle that she unwrapped to reveal several items that made Harrow curse with genuine alarm. A sheriff's badge with the name Marcus Hendricks. Miriam announced, holding up each item for the crowd to see. A wanted poster from Colorado Territory describing a man of Harrow's exact appearance, and a letter detailing his plan to eliminate any witnesses to his crimes in previous towns. The evidence was damning. But more importantly, it proved that at least some people in Burnt Hollow had been secretly working against Harrow's regime. Jonah had been gathering proof of the sheriff's true identity, probably for months, waiting for the right moment to act. You've been planning this, Harrow said, his voice carrying a note of grudging respect. The quiet blacksmith, too cowardly to save his own wife, suddenly grows a backbone. I was never too cowardly, Jonah replied, taking a step closer to the platform where Harrow held Evelyn. I was just waiting for the right moment. Waiting for you to reveal yourself completely. Waiting for Sarah to come home. The family reunion might have been touching under other circumstances, but Harrow still had a gun to Evelyn's head and 3 federal deputies drawing closer with each passing moment. The standoff was reaching its breaking point, and everyone involved knew that the next few minutes would determine who lived and who died. Here's what's going to happen, Harrow announced, his voice taking on the controlled desperation of a man with nothing left to lose. I'm going to walk out of here with my hostage. Anyone who tries to stop me will watch her brains splatter across this nice red dirt. Once I'm safely away from this godforsaken town, I'll consider releasing her somewhere she can find help. No. Sarah's refusal was flat and absolute. You're not leaving here alive, Marcus. Too many people have suffered for your crimes. Too many families have been destroyed. The killing stops today. Harrow's laugh was edged with hysteria. Then I guess we'll all go down together. Starting with your husband's new pet project here. His finger began to tighten on the trigger, and Evelyn closed her eyes, preparing for the end. But instead of the crack of gunfire, she heard a sound that would haunt her dreams for years to come. The wet thud of steel entering flesh, followed by Harrow's sharp gasp of surprise and pain. Jonah had moved with the speed and precision of a man who had spent his life working with metal and fire. The throwing knife he had concealed in his boot was perfectly balanced, designed for exactly this kind of desperate moment. It had taken Harrow in the shoulder, spinning him away from Evelyn and sending his gun flying across the platform. Before the sheriff could recover, Sarah and her deputies were in motion, covering the distance to the platform in seconds. Harrow tried to draw a backup weapon, but Jonah was already there, his blacksmith strength easily overpowering the wounded man. As federal handcuffs clicked around Harrow's wrists, the crowd finally found its voice. 3 years of suppressed anger and fear erupted in a roar that seemed to shake the very ground. These people had been living under the thumb of a murderer, allowing him to manipulate their fears and turn them against their neighbors. The shame and rage of that realization demanded an outlet, but Sarah Whitmore's voice cut through the mob's fury like a cold wind. He'll face federal justice, she announced. A proper trial with proper evidence, according to the law. We're not going to become the same kind of monster he is. As Evelyn was finally cut free from her bonds, her legs giving out from relief and exhaustion, she found herself caught in Jonah's strong arms. The blacksmith's face was streaked with tears for his lost daughter, for his returned wife, for the woman he had almost failed to save. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I should have acted sooner. I should have been braver." Evelyn looked up at him, then over at Sarah, who was supervising Harrow's medical treatment with the cold efficiency of someone who had seen too much violence to take pleasure in its aftermath. The marshal's scars told a story of survival against impossible odds, just as Jonah's guilt spoke of a man who had learned to live with the consequences of his choices. "We all do what we can with what we have," Evelyn said softly. "The important thing is that we did the right thing when it mattered most." As the sun reached its zenith over Burnt Hollow, casting sharp shadows across the testing ground that would soon be dismantled, the town began the long process of reckoning with its own complicity in Harrow's crimes. There would be no easy absolution, no simple return to the way things had been before. Too much damage had been done, too many lives had been lost or forever changed. But there was also hope, fragile and tentative, but real. The truth had finally come to light, and with it, the possibility of building something better from the ashes of what had been destroyed. The weeks that followed Harrow's arrest passed in a blur of federal investigations, witness testimonies, and the slow, painful process of a community coming to terms with its own complicity in years of systematic abuse. Federal marshals descended on Burnt Hollow like locusts, examining every suspicious death, every disappearance, every unexplained accident that had occurred during Harrow's reign of terror. What they found was worse than anyone had imagined. Marcus Harrow, whose real name turned out to be Marcus Hendricks, and who had used at least 4 other aliases during his criminal career, had been perfecting his system of control for over a decade. Burnt Hollow was just the latest in a string of small frontier towns that he had infiltrated, corrupted, and ultimately destroyed through carefully orchestrated campaigns of fear and manipulation. The pattern was always the same. Arrive with forged credentials and references, establish himself as a lawman, then begin systematically eliminating anyone who might threaten his authority or expose his crimes. He had a particular talent for identifying social outcasts and vulnerable individuals who could serve as scapegoats when the pressure to solve mysterious deaths became too great. In Burnt Hollow alone, the federal investigation uncovered evidence linking him to at least 12 murders, including Sarah and Emma Whitmore's supposed deaths 3 years earlier. The house fire that had supposedly killed them had been arson carefully staged to look like an accident while eliminating the only family in town with the connections and courage to challenge his authority. Sarah had survived only by chance. A loose floorboard in her bedroom had given way when the flames reached their peak, dropping her into the root cellar below the house. She had crawled out through a drainage tunnel burns, covering half her body, to find her daughter's lifeless form in what remained of the kitchen. The grief and rage that followed had driven her to spend 3 years tracking Harrow across the territories, gathering evidence and building a federal case strong enough to ensure his conviction. Evelyn had been intended as his final victim in Burnt Hollow, a convenient scapegoat to blame for any remaining loose ends before he moved on to his next target. Her arrival as a friendless mail-order bride with no local connections had been perfect for his purposes. After her execution, he would have let the town settle into uneasy quiet for a few months before disappearing with whatever valuables he could steal, leaving behind another community traumatized and broken by his manipulation. The federal trial, when it finally took place in the territorial capital, was a sensation that drew reporters from as far away as San Francisco and Denver. Harrow's defense attorney tried to argue that his client had been maintaining order in a lawless frontier town, that his methods might have been harsh but were necessary for survival in such harsh conditions. The argument fell apart completely when Sarah Whitmore took the stand. Her testimony was delivered in the same cold, precise voice she had used to arrest Harrow. But the details she provided painted a picture of systematic sadism that left the courtroom in stunned silence. She described how Harrow had bragged about killing her daughter, how he had detailed his plans to eliminate other families that might threaten his control, how he had laughed while describing the ways he planned to torment his victims before killing them. When the defense attorney suggested that her testimony was unreliable, due to the trauma she had suffered, Sarah simply removed her hat and turned to show the jury the full extent of the scars covering the left side of her face and neck. The burns had healed badly, leaving twisted ridges of scar tissue that pulled at her skin and limited the movement of her left eye. "I carry the evidence of his crimes on my body," she said simply. "Every day when I look in a mirror, I see what Marcus Harrow is capable of. And every day, I remember that my daughter died screaming his name." The jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning a verdict of guilty on all counts. Harrow was sentenced to hang, but even that wasn't the end of the story. 3 days before his scheduled execution, he was found dead in his cell, apparently having fashioned a noose from his bed sheets. Whether it was suicide or frontier justice, administered by someone with access to the territorial prison, was never officially determined, but no one mourned his passing. Meanwhile, Burnt Hollow struggled to rebuild both its physical structures and its sense of community. The testing ground where Evelyn had nearly died was the first thing to be dismantled, the wooden stakes burned, and the water pit filled with stones. The bone wind chimes that had provided such an ominous soundtrack to Harrow's reign were taken down and buried in the desert, replaced by simple metal bells that rang with clear, clean notes in the mountain wind. Pastor Matheson had resigned his position immediately after Harrow's arrest, his shame at participating in the witch trials, making it impossible for him to continue leading a congregation he felt he had betrayed. He left town quietly one morning, carrying only a single bag and leaving behind a letter, apologizing to everyone he had wronged through his cowardice and willingness to be manipulated. Doc Patterson, by contrast, threw himself into the work of healing both bodies and souls, damaged by years of living under Harrow's thumb. He had been one of the few people in town to maintain detailed records of suspicious deaths and accidents, and his testimony had been crucial in establishing the full scope of Harrow's crimes. The guilt he felt at not speaking up sooner drove him to provide free medical care to anyone who needed it, including the families of Harrow's victims. Tom Henderson, devastated by the revelation that his mother had been murdered to provide evidence against an innocent woman, sold his property and left Burnt Hollow entirely. Before departing, however, he sought out Evelyn to offer a personal apology that left both of them in tears. "I wanted someone to blame," he admitted, his voice thick with shame. "Losing Ma was so hard, and when Harrow offered me a target for all that anger and grief, I took it. I'm sorry, Miss Cartwright. I'm sorry I almost let an innocent woman die because I couldn't face the truth about what really happened." Evelyn had forgiven him, of course, understanding better than most how grief and fear could drive people to terrible choices. But she also understood why he couldn't stay in a place that would forever remind him of his mother's murder and his own complicity in the injustice that followed. The relationship between Jonah and Sarah proved more complicated than anyone had expected. 3 years of believing his wife was dead, followed by the revelation that she had spent that time becoming someone he barely recognized, created a gulf between them that couldn't be easily bridged. Sarah's transformation from gentle wife and mother to hard-bitten federal marshal had been necessary for her survival. But it had also changed her in fundamental ways that made returning to their old life impossible. They tried at first to recapture what they had lost. Jonah moved back into the house he had shared with Sarah before the fire, and she attempted to resume some version of domestic life while on leave from her marshal duties. But the ghosts were too strong. Emma's empty bedroom, the scorch marks on the walls that had been painted over, but never truly hidden the memories of happiness that had been destroyed by violence and could never be fully restored. The final break came when Sarah announced that she had been offered a permanent position as a U.S. Marshal based in Colorado Territory. It was a chance to continue the work that had given her life meaning during the dark years after losing her daughter, and more importantly, It was a chance to escape the constant reminders of what she had lost. "I can't be who I was before," she told Jonah during their last conversation before her departure. "That woman died in the fire, along with our daughter. The person I am now, she needs to keep moving, keep fighting, keep making sure that men like Harrow can't destroy other families the way he destroyed ours." Jonah understood, even though it broke his heart. The woman he had married was gone, replaced by someone stronger, but also lonelier, someone who carried scars that went far deeper than the burns on her face. He kissed her goodbye at the stagecoach station, knowing it would be the last time they would see each other as husband and wife, even if they never formally divorced. As Sarah's stage disappeared into the desert distance, Jonah found himself standing alone in the place where Evelyn's ordeal had begun just weeks earlier. But this time, he wasn't alone for long. Evelyn had come to see Sarah off as well, and in the shared sadness of watching another family torn apart by Harrow's legacy, they found a different kind of connection than either had expected. "What will you do now?" Jonah asked as they walked back toward town together. Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, considering her options. Thomas Brennan's death had left her without a husband or a home, but it had also left her with a small inheritance, the man's ranch, and a modest sum of money that would allow her to make her own choices about the future. "I've been thinking about that," she said finally. "This town has been through hell, and there are a lot of people who need help putting their lives back together. Maybe I could start a school or a place where women who've been hurt could come to heal and start over." It was an ambitious dream. But as Jonah looked at this woman who had faced down a mob and nearly died for the crime of existing in the wrong place at the wrong time, he found himself believing that she could make it reality. There was a strength in Evelyn Cartwright that went beyond mere survival, a determination to transform suffering into something constructive, to build rather than tear down. Over the following months, that dream began to take shape. Using Thomas Brennan's inheritance as seed money and Jonah's skills as a blacksmith to provide the necessary construction work, they began converting the abandoned ranch into something unprecedented on the frontier, a refuge for women fleeing abusive situations, complete with a small school where both children and adults could learn to read and write. The work was hard and often discouraging. Many of the women who came to them arrived broken in body and spirit, requiring months of careful care before they could begin to heal. Some never fully recovered from their traumatic experiences. Others found the courage to build new lives, but chose to do so elsewhere, carrying the skills and confidence they had gained to other towns and territories. But there were also victories, small at first, then growing larger as word of the refuge spread throughout the territory. Maria Santos arrived after escaping from a mining camp where she had been held as virtual slave labor and stayed to become the refuge's head cook and a fierce advocate for other Hispanic women facing similar exploitation. Rebecca Chen, the daughter of Chinese immigrants who had fled an arranged marriage to an abusive, much older man, became their teacher and eventually opened a second school in the territorial capital. Miriam Collins, whose courage in speaking truth at the moment of greatest danger had helped save Evelyn's life, became the refuge's unofficial coordinator. Her experience as one of the few black women in a predominantly white community gave her unique insights into the challenges faced by women who existed at the margins of frontier society. Her gentle strength and practical wisdom helped many newcomers navigate the complex process of building new identities after escaping their old lives. The relationship between Evelyn and Jonah evolved slowly and organically during this period. What had begun as shared trauma and mutual respect gradually deepened into something more profound. They worked side by side every day, facing the challenges of building something meaningful from the wreckage of their shattered community. And in that shared labor, they found a love that was very different from the romantic fantasies that had originally brought Evelyn to Burnt Hollow. This was love, built on respect and understanding, on the knowledge that they had seen each other at their worst and chosen to stay anyway. It was the love of two people who had learned that survival wasn't enough, that the real challenge was finding ways to help others not just survive, but thrive. They married 2 years after Harrow's execution in a simple ceremony conducted by a traveling minister in the main room of their refuge. The guests included all the residents of their growing community, along with visitors from neighboring towns who had come to see what these two unlikely partners had built from the ashes of tragedy. Sarah Whitmore wasn't there. She was somewhere in Colorado tracking down another criminal and fighting for justice in her own hard way. But she had sent a letter that Evelyn treasured, expressing her hope that Jonah had found the peace and happiness that had been stolen from him by violence. It was a blessing from a woman who understood that sometimes the greatest act of love was letting go. 5 years after the witch trials that had nearly claimed her life, Evelyn Cartwright Whitmore stood on the porch of the building that had become the heart of her world, watching the sun set over the desert landscape that had once seemed so threatening. The Burnt Hollow Women's Refuge now housed 37 residents ranging in age from 8 to 62, all women who had found their way to this sanctuary after escaping situations that had threatened to break their spirits, if not their bodies. The refuge itself had grown far beyond her original vision. What had started as a simple shelter had evolved into a small community with its own school workshop spaces, where women could learn trades like blacksmithing and carpentry, a medical clinic staffed by Doc Patterson, and 2 nurses who had come west specifically to work with trauma survivors, and even a small library that had been donated by supporters from as far away as San Francisco. The success of the refuge had attracted attention from reformers and women's rights advocates throughout the territories, leading to the establishment of similar facilities in other frontier towns. Evelyn found herself corresponding with activists in Denver, Santa Fe, and San Antonio, sharing strategies for helping women rebuild their lives and advocating for legal reforms that would protect vulnerable populations from exploitation. It was demanding work that often left her exhausted, but it was also deeply fulfilling in ways she had never imagined during her desperate journey from Chicago. Every woman who learned to read, every child who grew up in safety, every family that was reunited or newly formed within the refuge's walls represented a victory against the forces that had nearly destroyed her. The town of Burnt Hollow itself had been slowly healing as well, though the process was neither quick nor complete. Many of the families who had participated in the witch trials had left unable to live with the guilt of what they had almost done, or unwilling to face the daily reminder of their own capacity for evil. New people had moved in to take their places, often individuals drawn by the refuge's reputation for helping those who needed a second chance. The new Burnt Hollow was a very different place from the fear-dominated community that Harrow had controlled. Town meetings were open and contentious, with residents arguing passionately about everything from school funding to water rights. It was messy and sometimes frustrating, but it was also genuinely democratic in a way that the previous artificial harmony had never been. Pastor Matheson had been replaced by a young minister named David Walsh, whose sermons focused on practical ethics and community responsibility rather than supernatural threats. Walsh had been specifically chosen by the congregation because of his experience working with immigrant communities in San Francisco, where he had learned to appreciate the complexity of human nature and the importance of addressing social problems through action rather than just prayer. Doc Patterson had thrived in the new environment, his medical practice expanding to serve not just the refugee residents, but also travelers passing through the territory. He had become something of an expert in treating trauma-related conditions, and his research on the long-term effects of psychological abuse was beginning to influence medical thinking throughout the West. Even more importantly, he had trained several of the refugee residents as medical assistants, creating a core of skilled healthcare workers who understood from personal experience what it meant to survive violence and abuse. This combination of medical knowledge and lived experience proved incredibly effective in helping new arrivals begin the healing process. Jonah had found his own form of fulfillment in the refuge's work. his blacksmith skills proving invaluable not just for construction and maintenance, but also as a teaching tool for women who wanted to learn trades that would give them economic independence. His workshop had become a place where residents could work with their hands while processing their experiences, the rhythm of hammer on anvil, providing a meditative backdrop for difficult conversations about past trauma and future hopes. He had also become an advocate for legal reforms that would give women greater protection under territorial law. His testimony before the territorial legislature about the systematic abuse he had witnessed in Burnt Hollow had helped pass legislation requiring proper investigation of domestic violence complaints and establishing penalties for officials who ignored such reports. But perhaps the most meaningful change in Jonah's life was his relationship with Ana Maria Santos, a 7-year-old girl whose mother had died during their escape from a mining camp, and who had become, in all but legal terms, his and Evelyn's adopted daughter. Ana Maria's infectious laughter and boundless curiosity had helped heal wounds in both adults that they hadn't even realized were still bleeding. The girl was now 8 years old and already showing signs of the fierce independence that characterized so many of the refugee residents. She spoke 3 languages, fluently could shoe a horse almost as well as Jonah, despite her small size, and had appointed herself the unofficial welcome committee for new arrivals. Her presence served as a constant reminder that the refuge wasn't just about surviving the past, but about building a future where children could grow up safe and free. As Evelyn watched the stars emerge in the clear desert sky, she found herself thinking about the letter that had arrived that morning from Sarah Whitmore, now U.S. Marshal Sarah Whitmore, based permanently in Colorado Territory. Sarah's letters came irregularly, sometimes months apart, but they were always welcome glimpses into the life of a woman who had chosen a different path toward healing. The latest letter had contained news both sad and hopeful. Sarah had finally tracked down and arrested the gang of men who had worked with Harrow during his early career, bringing closure to the families of dozens of victims across multiple territories. But she had also written about a new assignment that would take her to Montana Territory, where reports of systematic abuse at several Army forts had reached federal attention. "I know you think I should settle down, find some peace," Sarah had written in her precise, economical handwriting. "But this work is my peace. Every criminal I bring to justice, every corrupt official I expose, every victim I help find closure. It's how I honor Emma's memory and make sure her death wasn't meaningless." Evelyn understood that choice, even if she had made a different one herself. Both women had survived Harrow's attempt to destroy them, but they had processed that survival in very different ways. Sarah had become a sword of justice striking at the darkness wherever she found it. Evelyn had become a beacon of hope, offering light to those struggling to escape that same darkness. Neither approach was superior to the other. They were simply different expressions of the same fundamental refusal to let evil triumph unopposed. A sound from inside the house interrupted her contemplation. Ana Maria calling for help with her arithmetic homework, a delightfully normal problem in a life that had once seemed destined for anything but normalcy. Evelyn smiled and headed inside, where Jonah was already seated at the kitchen table with papers spread around him, his own work on refuge business temporarily set aside to help their daughter master the mysteries of long division. This was what victory looked like, she realized. Not the dramatic confrontations and federal trials that made newspaper headlines, but the quiet daily work of helping people rebuild their lives. One conversation, one lesson, one act of kindness at a time. It was children doing homework in safety, women learning to read by lamplight survivors, discovering that they were strong enough not just to endure, but to help others endure as well. Outside, the desert wind played through the metal chimes that had replaced the bone talismans of Harrow's era, their clear notes carrying across the darkness like messages of hope. Burnt Hollow had found its voice again, and it was singing of redemption, community, and the unshakable human capacity to build something beautiful from even the most broken foundations. As she settled in to help Ana Maria with her homework, Evelyn thought once more of her mother's final words. promise me, you'll find a way to live, not just survive." She had kept that promise, and in doing so had helped dozens of other women and children find their own ways to thrive rather than merely endure. It wasn't the life she had imagined when she boarded that stagecoach in Chicago all those years ago, but it was a life of meaning and purpose that exceeded anything she could have dreamed. And every day as she watched the community they had built continue to grow and flourish, she felt her mother's presence like a blessing on the work they were doing. The witch trials of Burnt Hollow had been intended to destroy an innocent woman and terrorize a community into submission. Instead, they had sparked a transformation that would ripple outward for generations, proving that even the darkest evil could be turned toward the light by people with the courage to stand up and say, "This ends here. This ends now. This ends with us." In the end, that might be the most powerful magic of all, the ability of ordinary people to transform suffering into strength, fear into hope, and isolation into community. It was magic that required no supernatural power, only the very human capacity to choose love over hate, cooperation over domination, and healing over revenge. As the night deepened over the refuge and its sleeping residents, Evelyn Cartwright Whitmore closed her eyes and smiled, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to prove that light was always stronger than darkness, no matter how deep the shadows might seem. The story of Burnt Hollow had begun with a lie told by a man who thought power came from controlling others through fear. It had ended with a truth discovered by people who learned that real power came from helping each other find strength they never knew they possessed. And in that truth, the desert town had finally found its way home.